The day they sold the barn, they sold the children with it. It was not written on the deed, not in any legal sense, but it was understood in the way that rust was understood to follow rain. The 5 of them stood by the splintered corral fence, a small, ragged island in a sea of dusty boots and murmuring men. The auctioneer, a man named Garrus whose face was a sour map of greed, did not look at them. He gestured toward the great, sagging structure of the barn, its timbers silvered and tired by 100 winters. "And the barn," he'd bellowed, his voice oiled with false bonhomie, "comes with all its contents." The contents were a few rusted tools, a hay fork with a missing tine, and them. Alara stood tallest, a girl stretched thin as a fence rail by 16 years of want. Her hand rested on the shoulder of her brother, Finn, who was 12 and had a scowl carved permanently onto his face. Beside them, the twins, Rose and Lily, clutched at the frayed edges of Alara's skirt. They were 7, their faces pale and smudged with dirt, their eyes wide and dark like the mouths of empty wells. And in the crook of Alara's other arm, she held Sam, not yet 2, his small body a warm, trusting weight against her hip. He slept, oblivious, his breath a tiny flag of life in the harsh afternoon sun. They were orphans. The word itself was a stone in the mouths of the townsfolk who watched. Their parents had been taken by the fever last fall, leaving behind nothing but debts and 5 children who clung to each other like wet paper. Garrus, a distant cousin with a vulture's patience, had let them stay in the shack behind the barn through the winter, waiting for the spring thaw to sell the land and everything on it. The crowd shifted. A few women looked away, their lips pressed into thin lines of pity that did nothing. Most of the men just appraised the barn's roofline, calculated the cost of new lumber, and saw the children as one more chore that came with the purchase. Problem to be solved. Sent to the workhouse in the city most likely. Scattered like dandelion seeds in a mean wind. Alara did not look at them. She fixed her gaze on a knot of wood in the fence post, tracing its whorls with her eyes. She had learned long ago that meeting someone's gaze was an invitation, and she had nothing left to invite but sorrow. Her silence was a shield, thin and brittle, but it was all she had. Finn's small hand balled into a fist at his side. He glared at the boots of the men, a useless, fiery defiance burning in his chest. The bidding was sluggish. The farm was poor, the soil thin. Men kicked at the dirt, weighed the cost against the harvest. Garrus's voice grew strained. Then, a new presence made itself known. Not with a sound, but with a shift in the air. At the back of the small crowd, a man stood alone. He was tall, his frame lean and hard like the land he worked. His coat was the color of dust, his boots scuffed and worn. He did not look at the barn. He looked at the children. His name was Silas. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a quiet, settled grief that had hollowed him out from the inside. Beside him stood his wife, Maeve, a woman who seemed to be made of the same weary earth as her husband. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her knuckles white. She had a face that might have been soft once, before sorrow had planed it down to its essential, resilient bone. They were a silent couple, known for their industry and their isolation. Their own small grave on the hill behind their house was a testament to the reason for their quiet. A baby, taken by the cold before he'd ever seen a spring. Maeve's gaze was fixed on Sam, sleeping in Alara's arms. A flicker of something, a pain so deep it was almost unreadable, crossed her face. She leaned toward her husband, a movement so slight it was barely a breath, and whispered something against the collar of his coat. Silas's expression did not change, but his gaze sharpened. He watched Alara, saw the tension in her thin shoulders, the fierce, protective angle of her jaw. He saw not a burden, but a mirror of his own stubborn refusal to break. $50 for the barn and its contents, Garrus barked, a final, desperate plea. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the afternoon heat. Then, a voice, low and steady as a river stone. 60. Every head turned. Silas stood unmoved, his eyes still on the children. Garrus blinked, surprised. $60 from Silas Blackwood. Do I hear 65? Another man, a portly merchant from town, scoffed. The lumber ain't worth that. Silas's gaze shifted to him, flat and uninviting. The merchant looked away. $60 going once? Garrus chanted, his spirits lifting. Going twice. He slammed a grimy hand down on a barrelhead. Sold. To Silas Blackwood for $60. A murmur went through the crowd. Coins were exchanged, a slip of paper signed. Garrus, his pockets heavier, finally turned his attention to the children. He gestured dismissively. They're all yours now. Good luck with that. Silas ignored him. He walked toward the fence, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to spook them, as if they were a herd of wild, skittish deer.
Ilera tensed, pulling some closer.
Finn stepped in front of her, his small body a fragile barricade. Silas did not offer a hand. He did not smile. He simply looked at Ilera, a direct and solemn gaze that asked for nothing and offered no false promises. Come on, he said. His voice was not unkind. It was just a fact like the sun or the wind. Maeve came to stand beside him. She held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She didn't look at Ilera either, but at the twins, who peeked out from behind the skirt. Her expression was guarded, a wall of caution built around a core of aching want. Ilera hesitated. She looked at the faces of the departing townsfolk, their backs already turned. She looked at Garrus, counting his coins. Then she looked back at Silas, this quiet man with winter in his eyes, and the woman beside him who looked like she might shatter if the wind blew too hard. It was a choice between a known cruelty and an unknown silence. She took a breath that felt like she was breathing in dust and grit. She adjusted Sam in her arms, took Finn's hand, and with a soft click of her tongue, called the twins to her side. She walked through the gate that Silas held open for her, and they left the only home they had ever known. The journey to the Blackwood farm was a long, silent procession. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts. Silas walked ahead, setting a slow, steady pace. Maeve walked beside Ilera, but a careful distance remained between them, a chasm of unspoken things. The twins, tired and frightened, stumbled. Without a word, Finn took one of their hands, and Ilera took the other. They moved as one unit, a small, battered constellation. Halfway there, Lily began to cry, a thin, hopeless sound. Maeve stopped. She unwrapped her bundle. It was bread and a piece of dried apple. She knelt, not looking at Ilera, but directly at the small, weeping girl. Here, she said, her voice thin, as if it hadn't been used for such a purpose in a long time. She broke off a piece of bread and held it out. Lily looked to Ilera for permission. Ilera watched Maeve's hand, saw the slight tremble in it, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Lily took the bread. They arrived as the sun was bleeding a blood-orange stain across the western sky. The farm was stark and clean. A small, neat house stood beside a barn that was in good repair. Everything was weathered but cared for. There were no flowers, no adornments, only the raw, functional beauty of a place that wrestled a living from the earth. On a low hill behind the house stood a single, small wooden cross. Ilera saw it and understood something of the silence that filled this place. Silas led them not to the main house, but to a small, clean room above the summer kitchen. It was bare, with a wide planked floor and a single window that looked out over the fields. But it was dry and smelled faintly of soap and cedar. "You'll sleep here," Silas said. It was not a question. Maeve appeared a moment later. She carried a stack of clean, threadbare blankets and a pail of fresh water. She set them down just inside the door, her movements efficient and detached. She laid a bar of lye soap next to the pail. She did not cross the threshold into the room. It was their space, a territory defined. That night, for the first time in a year, they had a solid roof over their heads that they did not have to defend. Ilera lay awake long after the others had succumbed to exhaustion, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. the creak of a floorboard below, the sigh of the wind in the eaves. It was not the sound of home. It was the sound of a truce. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Work was the language of the Blackwood farm. Silas rose before the sun, his boots thudding softly on the porch. Elara, an early riser by habit and necessity, would already be awake. She watched him from the small window, saw him move through the gray dawn light, his shoulders set against the coming day. A silent contract was drawn. Food appeared on the scrubbed wooden table in the kitchen 3 times a day. Simple fare: oatmeal, bread, stew. But there was always enough. Maeve would cook, her movements economical and precise, her back a rigid line. Elara, after a day of watching, began to help without being asked. She swept the floor. She drew water from the well. She washed the dishes, her hands moving in the same basin of warm water as Maeve's, their fingers sometimes brushing, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through both of them. They never spoke of it. Silas gave Finn chores. Not make work, but real tasks: mending a stretch of fence, clearing stones from a field that Silas intended to plant. He didn't praise the boy, but he showed him how to hold the hammer properly, how to brace the post. Finn, who had only ever known how to fight or flee, slowly began to learn the language of building something. His scowl did not disappear, but it softened around the edges. The twins, Rose and Lily, were like small, wild things slowly being tamed. At first, they stayed glued to Elara's side. But the farm had spaces that called to a child's curiosity. A patch of moss behind the barn, a line of busy ants. Maeve, while hanging laundry, would sometimes leave a small, smooth stone on the porch rail or a brightly colored feather. She never acknowledged giving the gifts, and the girls never acknowledged receiving them. But the small treasures began to accumulate in a corner of their attic room. One afternoon, Elara was scrubbing the porch steps when she saw Maeve walking back from the hill with the small cross. Her steps were slow, her head bowed. Elara watched until she disappeared into the house. The next day, Elara walked the fence line until she found a single, stubborn wild primrose pushing its way through the hard soil. She picked it, carried it carefully back to the farm, and when no one was looking, she climbed the small hill and laid the pale yellow flower at the base of the wooden cross. She did not know if Maeve ever saw it. But the next morning, a small pitcher of milk, richer than the kind they usually got, was left on the step outside their room. A bond was being woven, not with words, but with raw thread of shared labor and small, anonymous kindnesses. The silence in the house began to change. It was less a heavy blanket of grief and more a wide, open space, waiting to be filled. Sometimes, in the evening, Lily would hum a little tune while she played with her found treasures. The sound was fragile in the quiet room, but no one told her to stop. The house, which had held its breath for so long, was beginning to breathe again. One night, a storm rolled in, a great, booming beast of thunder and lightning. Rain hammered against the roof. A crack of thunder, louder than the rest, shook the small house to its foundations. A frightened cry came from the attic. Elara was already soothing the twins, but Sam was wailing, inconsolable. The door to their room creaked open. Maeve stood there, silhouetted by the lamp she held. The light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, she just stood there, her face a mask of uncertainty. Then she crossed the threshold. She walked over to the pallet where the children huddled and sat down on the floor beside them. She didn't say anything. She just sat, the lamplight a warm, steady pool around them, a silent promise against the raging storm outside. She stayed until the thunder grumbled its way into the distance and the children's breathing had deepened into sleep. Later, after she had gone, Elara sat by the window, watching the rain wash the world clean. She felt a question lodged in her throat, a question she had been holding for weeks. The next evening, as she and Maeve were clearing the supper dishes, she finally let it out. Her voice was low, barely a whisper. "Why?" Maeve paused, a plate halfway to the basin. She did not pretend to misunderstand. She stared down at the plate, at the faint patterns of wear on its surface. "The house was too quiet," she said, her voice just as low. She looked up and met Alara's eyes for the first time, a look of such profound, unadorned sorrow that it took Alara's breath away. "It's a terrible thing, a quiet house." It was not an explanation. It was a confession. And in that moment, the foundation of their strange, silent arrangement shifted. It was no longer about charity or duty. It was about filling an emptiness. Two emptinesses, meeting in the middle. That night, Silas found a small, lopsided loaf of bread on the table, baked by Alara. It was a little burnt on the bottom. He ate a piece, his expression thoughtful. "A little dry," he remarked to Maeve later, in the privacy of their own room. Maeve, turning down the lamp, allowed a tiny smile to touch her lips. "You didn't complain about mine," he grunted, a sound that was almost a laugh. Outside, the wind turned, but inside the house, a different kind of weather was settling in. The peace was a fragile thing, a skin of ice over deep water. They had almost forgotten the world beyond the fence posts, but the world had not forgotten them. A rider appeared on the horizon one Tuesday morning, a dark speck growing steadily larger against the pale sky. Finn saw him first and ran to the barn where Silas was sharpening a scythe. "A rider, Silas," he said, his voice tight with an old, familiar fear. Silas set the sharpening stone down. He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements unhurried, but his eyes were fixed on the approaching figure. Alara came to the kitchen door, the twins hiding behind her skirts. Maeve stood beside her, her hands twisting in her apron. It was Garrus. He reined his horse in at the edge of the yard, careful not to come too close. He surveyed the scene, the mended fence, the children looking healthier, Alara standing straight and proud. A sneer curled his lip. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying an unpleasant authority. "There's been a development." Silas walked out to meet him, stopping a good 10 feet away. He did not invite him closer. "State your business, Garrus." "My business is with my property," Garrus said, gesturing with his thumb toward the children. "Turns out there was some interest after all. A man who runs the mining camp over in the next county. He'll take the lot of them, pay a fair price too. More than the 60 you paid for a broken-down barn." A cold dread washed over Alara. The workhouse was one thing. The mines were a death sentence. Silas's face was granite. "The deal is done. You were paid." "For the barn," Garrus countered, his voice slick. "The contents were included, yes, but not by name on the deed. It's a legal gray area. A misunderstanding. I'm here to correct it." He's offering $100. "I'll even give you your 60 back for your trouble," he smiled, a predator's grin. "It's a good deal. Takes them off your hands." "They are not on my hands," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "They are in my house." "It's not your house there'll be trouble in, it's the town's. People are talking, taking in strays like that. It ain't right." The ground between them became a battlefield. The argument was not about money or law or even the children. It was about ownership. About a man like Garrus's belief that people could be owned, and a man like Silas's quiet, unshakable conviction that they could not. Silas took a half-step forward. "They stay here." Garrus's eyes narrowed. He was a bully used to people folding under his bluster. "You have no claim, Blackwood. They're not your blood. You have no papers on them." "I have my word," Silas said simply. Garrus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your word ain't worth $100. He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "I'll be back Friday with the man from the mines. And the sheriff if I have to. Have them ready." He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and fear hanging in the air. Silence descended on the farmyard. The world seemed to shrink to that small patch of threatened ground. Finn looked up at Silas, his eyes blazing. "You can't let him." "I won't," Silas said. But Alara saw the doubt that flickered behind his resolve. Garrus was right. They had no legal claim. They were just two quiet people on a lonely farm against a man with greed and the semblance of law on his side. That night, the house was quiet again, but it was the old quiet. A heavy, suffocating silence filled with unspoken fear. Alara packed their few meager belongings into a bundle. When the time came, they would run. It was what they knew how to do. She would not let her family be sent to the mines. She was creeping down the stairs in the pre-dawn darkness when she saw a light in the kitchen. Silas was sitting at the table, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, staring at the wall. Maeve was standing by the stove, her arms wrapped around herself. They heard her on the stairs. Neither of them looked surprised. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," Alara's voice trembled, "or the most foolish." Silas finally looked at her. He saw the bundle in her hand. "Running won't get you far. It will get us away from here," she shot back, her fear making her bold. "And where will you go?" Maeve asked, her voice aching with a truth Alara didn't want to hear. "The world ain't kind to children on their own." Alara had no answer. Her defiance crumbled, leaving only a raw, desperate terror. "What are we going to do?" Silas stood up. He walked over to the hearth and picked up the poker, testing its weight. "We're going to wait for Friday." Friday arrived under a bruised purple sky that threatened rain. The air was thick and still. The land itself was holding breath. Silas stood on the porch. He held no weapon, but his stance was as unyielding as an old oak. Maeve stood in the doorway behind him, a silent pillar of support. Alara had sent the twins and Sam to hide in the hayloft of the barn, a place of soft shadows and the sweet smell of summer. But Finn refused to go. He stood on the porch a few feet from Silas, his hands clutching a smooth, heavy river stone. Just after noon they appeared. Two riders, Garrus, and a thick-set man with a cruel, impassive face. They stopped at the yard's edge, just as before. "Blackwood," Garrus called, his confidence bolstered by his companion. "I'm here to collect my property." "You're on my land, Garrus," Silas said, his voice calm but carrying across the yard. "And you have no property here." The mining man spat on the ground. "We can do this easy or we can do this hard. The law's on our side." "There is no law that says you can buy children," Maeve said from the doorway, her voice ringing with a strength no one had ever heard from her before. Garrus sneered. "The woman finds her tongue." He looked past them, toward the house. "Where are they? Send them out." At that moment, the front door swung open wider. Alara stepped out onto the porch. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. In her hands, she held Silas's heavy iron skillet, gripping its handle like a weapon. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence was a declaration. Garrus faltered for a second, taken aback by the united front. For people, a man, a woman, a boy with a rock, and a girl with a frying pan. It was pathetic. Should have been easy. But there was something in their stillness, in their absolute refusal to yield, that gave him pause. It was the terrifying strength of people with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. "This is foolishness," the mining man grumbled, and he started to dismount. That was when Silas moved. He didn't run. He just walked down the steps and onto the yard, placing himself directly in the man's path. "You will not set foot on this porch," Silas said. The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact. The sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the iron in his hair. The man hesitated, his hand on his saddle. He looked at Silas's eyes and saw no fear, no anger, only a flat, bottomless resolve. He saw a man who would die on this patch of dirt before he took a single step backward. The man was a bully, and bullies prey on fear. There was none here to feed on. He looked at Garrus. "This ain't worth the trouble." Garrus stared, his face turning mottled with rage and disbelief. "They're just a farmer and his wife." "No," Silas said, his voice quiet but echoing in the tense silence. "We're a family." The word hung in the air, solid and irrefutable. The mining man grunted, swung himself back into the saddle, and turned his horse around without another word. Garrus, abandoned and humiliated, sputtered for a moment, shot a look of pure venom at the figures on the porch, and then wheeled his horse around to follow. They rode away, two shrinking figures of malice, swallowed by the vastness of the land. They stood there for a long time after, watching until the dust had settled. The tension broke slowly, like a fever. Finn's hand uncurled, the stone dropping to the dirt with a soft thud. Maeve came forward and gently took the heavy skillet from Alara's trembling hands. Her fingers wrapped around Alara's, and for the first time, she held on. Silas turned and walked back to the porch. He looked at Alara, at the fierce, loyal girl who had stood with them. He looked at Finn, the angry boy who had found his courage. He looked at Maeve, his wife, whose voice had finally returned. He put a hand on Finn's shoulder, a gesture of profound, unspoken pride. That evening, no one spoke of what had happened. There was no need. The victory was not in the driving away of Garrus, but in the standing together. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, chasing the shadows into the corners of the room. Maeve was brushing Lily's hair, her fingers deft and gentle. The twins were leaning against her, half asleep. Finn was sitting by the fire, attempting to carve a piece of wood with Silas's knife. Silas looked up from the harness he was mending and his eyes fell on the oldest girl, who was watching the flames, a quiet watchfulness in her face. "Alara," he said. It was the first time he had said her name. The sound of it in his low voice gave it a new weight, a new permanence. It wasn't the name of an orphan, a stray, a piece of property. It was her name. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. The next day, Silas and Finn did not repair the old gate. They tore it down, and together they built a new one, strong and straight. Maeve and the girls, with Alara's help, tilled a small patch of earth near the house. They planted seeds for beans and squash, and in a small corner, Maeve planted the seeds for the flowers she had not allowed herself in years. They brought the wild primrose from the lonely grave on the hill and gave it a new home in the garden, a place where it would not be alone. The old life, the one of running and fear, was over. The fire of that confrontation had not destroyed them. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And so their life was stitched together, not with blood, but with shared silence, with quiet acts of care, with bread and blankets and a skillet held like a shield. The seasons turned. The house was no longer quiet. It was filled with the sound of children's laughter, with the murmur of stories told by the fire, with the steady, rhythmic breathing of a family asleep under one roof. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the fireflies rise from the fields. Silas would whittle, his calloused hands creating small, smooth animals for the children. Maeve would hum, her voice no longer thin, but full and warm. And Alara, with Sam asleep in her lap, would watch over them all, her heart a quiet, steady drum in the peaceful dusk. She had not been rescued from a barn. She had been led to a home. They all had. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's about the quiet courage it takes to claim something, not as property, but as part of yourself. It's about how a family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build with your own two hands, from the broken pieces you find along the way. So many of us are standing in a dusty yard, being appraised by the world, feeling like we're just part of a lot to be sold with a broken-down barn. We're told we're a problem to be solved, a burden to be carried. But the story says something else. It says there is a profound power in the unspoken kindness. A quiet man with winter in his eyes, a grieving woman who leaves a feather on a railing, a girl who bakes a burnt loaf of bread as a thank you. These are the things that rebuild a world. It tells us that sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is a name. Not a label, but their true name spoken with respect. To see them, to say, Alara, and have it mean, you belong here, so here's your naming. You are not the sum of your losses. You are not the contents of a barn. You are a person standing on a porch with a strength you might not even recognize in yourself. And if you are brave enough to stand your ground, if you are quiet enough to hear the language of the heart, you might just find that the people who stand with you, they become your home. You might just find that you can build a new gate, plant a new garden, and watch the sun set on a life you chose. A life where the house finally, truly breathes.